A tired black veteran stepped off the bus, feeling the familiar weight of his old service bag. He had spent many years serving his country, and though the war was long over, the battles in his mind seemed never-ending. Today had been particularly exhausting, filled with memories that weren't so easy to shake. All he wanted was a quiet, peaceful meal, just a moment to sit down, gather his thoughts, and recharge for the road ahead. As he walked through the streets of the small town, he spotted a little restaurant tucked between two older buildings. It was a modest place, with a faded sign hanging above the door and a handful of cars parked out front. The aroma of food drifted through the open window, making his stomach growl. He hadn't eaten anything since early in the morning, and the idea of a hot meal was enough to bring a small smile to his face. Without hesitation, he stepped inside. The interior was simple, with wooden tables and chairs scattered across the floor. The quiet murmur of conversation and the clink of silverware filled the space. The veteran took a seat at a table near the window, where he could enjoy a bit of sunshine while he waited. He wasn't looking for much, just something to fill his stomach and a few moments of peace before continuing his journey. Soon, the restaurant owner appeared from behind the counter. He was a middle-aged white man, dressed in an apron that was stained with grease and food from hours of cooking. At first, the owner looked at the veteran as though he was just another customer. But then, as he approached, his expression changed subtly. There was a coldness in his eyes and a moment of hesitation before he spoke. The veteran noticed the shift, but he was too tired to make much of it. He simply nodded, ordered a meal, and waited. The owner didn't respond with the usual warmth that came from someone who appreciated their customers. Instead, he took the order without a smile, quickly retreating back to the kitchen. As the veteran sat there, he couldn't shake the strange feeling that something was off. The owner didn't return with any pleasantries, nor did he offer any sort of acknowledgement. It wasn't like the usual friendly small-town service that made customers feel welcome. Instead, the veteran was left to sit in silence, the tension hanging in the air. It wasn't long before the first subtle remark came. "I guess you're here just for the food, huh?" The owner muttered as he passed by the veteran's table. His tone wasn't friendly. The veteran, confused but not wanting to stir any trouble, simply nodded and looked out the window. But the remarks kept coming, each one more pointed, more cutting. Little jabs about his appearance, about where he was from, things that should have been left unsaid. The veteran's patience began to wear thin. He wasn't someone who was easily provoked, but there was something about the way this man treated him, as if his mere presence wasn't welcome. His heart began to race, his calm demeanor slipping. Yet he refused to make a scene. After all, this was a small town, and he was just passing through. All he wanted was a simple meal, nothing more. But it was becoming clear that this was turning into something else. What he didn't know was that this encounter would be far more than just a bad experience at a restaurant. It was about to become a moment that would forever change the course of his day, and possibly his life. As the veteran sat at the table, trying his best to ignore the tension in the air, the insults continued to trickle in. The remarks from the restaurant owner were no longer subtle. They were becoming more frequent and openly hostile, like little arrows aimed at him, each one hitting harder than the last. The veteran, feeling the sting of each word, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had learned long ago to ignore slights, to rise above the pettiness of others. But today was different. Something about the way the man spoke, the way he treated him, made him feel smaller than he had ever felt before. The owner came by the veteran's table again, this time more abrupt than ever. "You know, people like you don't usually come in here," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "I guess I'll have to go easy on you. Don't want to cause any trouble." His words hung in the air, and the veteran's blood began to boil. He didn't know what to say, but every fiber of his being screamed for him to stand up for himself. Yet he held back. He had spent too many years fighting on battlefields, too many years fighting for the respect of his fellow man. Was this really worth it? Was a meal worth risking trouble in a place where no one seemed to care? The veteran tried to take a deep breath, pushing the anger down. He didn't want to cause a scene, didn't want to make matters worse. But it was hard. The words were like a heavy weight pressing down on his chest. They stung more than he cared to admit, especially from someone who had no idea who he was, someone who didn't know the struggles he had faced. The owner seemed to take pleasure in his discomfort, as if it was some twisted game to him. "I'll just make sure you get your meal soon enough," the owner continued, his voice laced with a mock politeness that only made things worse. He walked away, but the veteran couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, judged. Every minute felt like an eternity as he sat there, alone with his thoughts, trying to calm himself. It was hard to keep his composure in a place where he was treated like an outsider, a stranger. The food, when it finally came, was hardly worth the wait. The veteran tried to eat, but the tension in the room made every bite taste bland, unappetizing. He was no stranger to discomfort, no stranger to hardships, but this was different. It wasn't the kind of discomfort that came from war or struggle. It was something deeper, something personal. He wasn't just being treated poorly because of his skin color. He was being belittled, made to feel less than. And that hurt more than anything else. As the veteran tried to finish his meal in peace, the restaurant owner kept his distance, but there was no mistaking the disdain in his eyes. The man's cold behavior made the veteran feel like an intruder in a place he should have been able to feel safe in. It wasn't just the words. It was the way the man looked at him, like he didn't belong. The veteran had fought for his country, for people who never fully understood what it meant to serve, and now, sitting in this small restaurant, he felt as if his service had meant nothing. Just as the veteran was finishing his meal, he couldn't help but feel like there was something off about the whole situation. This wasn't just a bad experience at a restaurant. It was something much deeper. It was a reminder of the prejudice he had faced throughout his life, something that no amount of medals or service could ever erase. Little did he know, his evening was about to take a surprising turn. The veteran had just finished his meal, but the taste still lingered, bitter, not from the food itself, but from the way he had been treated. He sat back in his chair, trying to steady his nerves, wishing he could just leave without causing any further disturbance. He looked around the small restaurant, but the atmosphere had only grown more uncomfortable. The few patrons sitting at nearby tables had gone silent, clearly aware of the tension. The restaurant felt smaller now, the air thick with unspoken judgments. He looked at the clock on the wall, hoping that time would speed up so he could leave. But as he stood to pay for his meal, something caught his eye. The door opened, and a young man walked in. He was tall, dressed in casual clothes, but there was something about his demeanor that immediately caught the veteran's attention. It wasn't the man's appearance that made the veteran take notice, but the way he looked at the restaurant owner, the look of someone who knew exactly what was going on. The young man's gaze locked onto the veteran for a moment, and then he quickly made his way to the counter. The owner, who had been glancing at the veteran all evening, stiffened when he saw the new arrival. There was an awkward pause, as if the two had some unspoken history between them. The veteran felt his curiosity spark, wondering who this man was and why the atmosphere shifted so suddenly. The young man addressed the restaurant owner in a tone that was both familiar and stern. "Dad, what's going on here?" he asked, his voice low but firm. The owner's face went pale at the mention of Dad, and for a moment, the veteran could see a flicker of guilt in the man's eyes. The young man didn't wait for a response. Instead, he turned to the veteran, his expression softening as he noticed the discomfort in the veteran's face. "Are you all right, sir?" he asked, genuinely concerned. The veteran didn't know what to say. The kindness in the young man's voice was a stark contrast to the way he had been treated moments before. "I'm fine, just trying to eat in peace," the veteran replied, his voice quiet but steady. The young man nodded, taking a step closer to the table. The tension between the restaurant owner and his son was palpable, and it didn't take long for the veteran to realize that the two of them weren't strangers. The younger man seemed to know exactly what had been happening, But it wasn't until he looked back at the veteran that the full weight of the situation began to sink in. "I'm sorry," the young man said, his voice heavy with regret. "This isn't who my father is. I don't know what's gotten into him lately. I didn't know you were treated like this. I'll take care of it." His words, though filled with remorse, didn't change the fact that the damage had already been done. The veteran could see that the son was genuinely trying to make amends, but it was hard to ignore the hurt that still lingered from the owner's behavior. Before the veteran could respond, the restaurant owner suddenly spoke, his voice trembling. "You don't know what you're talking about. This isn't a big deal," he muttered, trying to downplay the situation. But the young man wasn't having it. "No, Dad, it is a big deal," he said firmly. The veteran could see the young man's frustration rising as he turned to the owner. "You can't just treat people like this. Not in my name. Not in this restaurant." The veteran watched as father and son exchanged tense words, but something about the young man's determination caught his attention. There was a sincerity in his eyes, a kind of raw honesty that made the veteran feel like maybe, just maybe, there was still hope for some kind of resolution. As the confrontation continued, the veteran sat back in his chair, feeling conflicted. He wasn't sure what would come of all this, whether the owner would admit his mistake, or whether the situation would dissolve without any real change. But one thing was clear: the moment had shifted. The young man had recognized the injustice, and that made all the difference. The tension in the room was thick as the young man and his father continued to argue, their voices rising as the conversation grew more intense. The veteran, still seated at his table, felt like an observer to a family drama that had suddenly unfolded before him. It was clear the father and son were no strangers to conflict, but the veteran couldn't ignore the fact that something had changed in the air. The son had stepped up, spoken out, and tried to address the situation head-on. And in that moment, the veteran felt something he hadn't expected: hope. The young man turned to the veteran, his face now flushed with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. "I am so sorry, sir," he said earnestly. "I never knew my father acted like this. I don't know what's gotten into him. Please, let me make it right." The veteran nodded slowly, still unsure how to respond. He had been through so much in his life, seen the worst and the best of people, that it was hard for him to know who to trust anymore. But there was something genuine in the young man's eyes, something that made him believe this wasn't just an empty apology. It felt real. The veteran could see that this wasn't about defending his father's behavior. It was about trying to mend the damage, even if it couldn't be undone right away. The restaurant owner, who had been mostly silent during the exchange, finally spoke up, his voice a mix of defensiveness and frustration. "You don't understand, son," he grumbled. "This is how things have always been around here. People know where they stand. I didn't mean anything by it." But the young man wasn't having it anymore. He turned to face his father fully, his eyes locked on the older man's with a fierce determination. "No, Dad, that's not how things work anymore," he said, his voice unwavering. "You can't treat people like that. You can't judge them by the color of their skin or where they come from. Not anymore." The veteran watched as the father's expression faltered for a moment. For a brief second, the older man seemed to realize the weight of his words, the hurt he had caused. It was as if the truth had finally hit him, and he didn't know how to deal with it. I didn't mean to hurt anyone," the restaurant owner muttered, his voice smaller now, regret creeping into his tone. But it was hard for the veteran to know whether this was genuine remorse or just an attempt to save face. The damage had been done, and no amount of backpedaling could erase the sting of those earlier remarks. The son looked back at the veteran, his expression softer now. "I promise you, sir, I'll make sure this never happens again. My father, he's not a bad person, but sometimes he forgets how to treat people with respect. He's from a different time, but I won't let him hide behind that anymore." The veteran could see the sincerity in the young man's words, and it struck him. This wasn't about making excuses for the father. It was about taking responsibility for the future. "I understand," the veteran said, his voice quiet but firm. "But you have to make sure this kind of thing doesn't happen again. Not just to me, but to anyone else who walks in here." The veteran felt a sense of closure beginning to settle in. It wasn't the apology he had expected, but it was something real. The young man nodded, his face filled with resolve. "I will," he promised. "I'll talk to him, and we'll make it right." As the argument between father and son continued to simmer, the veteran stood up slowly, feeling a sense of relief. The meal had been nothing short of uncomfortable, but this encounter, this moment of truth, had shifted something inside him. It was a reminder that even in the face of prejudice and ignorance, there were people who would stand up, who would try to make things right. And that was something worth holding on to. As he made his way to the door, the young man followed him, his voice calm and steady. "Thank you, sir," he said. "I'm sorry for what happened. I hope you'll give us another chance." The veteran turned to him, offering a nod. "I'll think about it," he said. And with that, he stepped out into the fresh air, ready to move on, knowing that sometimes change didn't happen in an instant, but in moments of understanding. The veteran walked out of the restaurant, the weight of the encounter still heavy on his mind. The cool evening air hit his face as he stepped onto the sidewalk, and for a moment, he stood still, taking it all in. The street was quiet, the fading light of the day casting long shadows over the pavement. His thoughts were a swirl of emotions, none of them simple. He had just experienced something strange, something that had brought him back to a place he hadn't been in years, feeling judged, feeling small. But now, as he stood outside, there was a sense of relief, a quiet understanding that things weren't always as they seemed. Inside the restaurant, the young man stood by the door, watching as the veteran left. His father, standing behind the counter, was silent, still processing everything that had just transpired. The son had hoped that by confronting his father, he could bring about some change, but the situation was more complicated than he had imagined. It wasn't just about fixing the moment. It was about healing something that had been broken for a long time. The young man turned to his father, frustration clear in his eyes. "You don't get it, do you?" he asked, his voice low but filled with emotion. "That man, you hurt him. And it's not just him. It's everyone you've treated like that." The restaurant owner didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked down, his hands resting on the counter. For the first time, the young man saw the weight of regret in his father's posture. The man had always been hard on himself, hard on the world. But now he seemed small, as though the walls he had built around himself were starting to crumble. "I didn't mean it that way," the owner said quietly, almost to himself. His voice was thick with something between regret and confusion. "I've always just, well, you know how things were back then." The son let out a sigh, running a hand through his hair. "Yeah, I know. But times change, Dad. You can't keep using the past as an excuse for treating people like that. I don't want to be like you. And I don't want to work here if this is how things are going to be." His words were firm, but there was an underlying sadness in them. He didn't want to cut ties with his father, but the older man's actions were making it impossible for him to stay silent any longer. The restaurant owner seemed to take this in. His shoulders sagged, as if the weight of his son's words had finally sunk in. "I didn't think it was a big deal," he said, shaking his head slowly. "But I see now that it is. I see that I hurt him, and I hurt you too. You need to change." The son interrupted gently, but firmly. "We both do. This place, this business, it can be something better. But not if you keep treating people like that. You've got to do better." The silence between them stretched out, heavy with the realization that the conversation had only just begun. The restaurant owner didn't speak again for a long while, his eyes cast downward, deep in thought. The son, standing at the counter, waited, giving his father the space he needed to process. Outside, the veteran had already walked a few blocks away, But his mind was still on the restaurant, still on the words that had been exchanged. His footsteps echoed on the sidewalk as he moved forward, but inside, he felt a mix of emotions. Part of him wanted to forget the whole thing, to let it go, to never think about it again. But another part of him, the part that had fought in wars and seen so much of the world, couldn't shake the feeling that something important had happened today. The son's honesty, his willingness to confront his father, had made an impact. It was a rare thing in a world where people often stayed silent to avoid conflict. The veteran didn't know if he would ever go back to that restaurant. The memories of what had happened would stay with him for a long time, but there was something in the air now that hadn't been there before. Maybe it was a chance for change, a chance for the younger generation to make things right. He hoped so. As he reached the bus stop, the veteran looked back over his shoulder one last time. The restaurant stood quietly in the distance, its lights flickering in the growing dusk. Inside, father and son were still talking. And for the first time in a long while, the veteran felt a glimmer of hope that perhaps things could improve. Maybe, just maybe, the world was capable of change. The veteran walked down the quiet street, the cool breeze brushing against his face as he tried to shake off the weight of what had just happened. His thoughts were still tangled in the events of the restaurant, but now they felt like a distant echo, as if the world had shifted just slightly in the span of a few minutes. It wasn't often that someone's actions left such a mark on him, but today had been different. Today, he had seen something raw, something real, in the young man's eyes. He wasn't sure what the outcome would be, but for the first time in a long while, the veteran felt like he had witnessed a moment that mattered. As he continued walking, the sound of his footsteps was almost hypnotic, marking the passage of time. He didn't have a destination in mind. He was just moving forward, trying to put some distance between himself and the uncomfortable confrontation. The anger that had stirred inside him was slowly fading, replaced by a kind of quiet reflection. He had learned long ago not to expect much from people, especially from those who didn't know the struggles he had faced. But the young man, his honesty, his willingness to confront his father, had caught him off guard. It was something he hadn't expected to see in a world where conflict was so often avoided, where the uncomfortable truths were left unsaid. The veteran's thoughts drifted back to his own time in the service. He had seen so much, witnessed the best and worst of humanity, and the lessons from those years had shaped the man he was. But even now, as he stood on the street corner, he realized that those lessons didn't always apply. People could surprise you, and sometimes they didn't fit the roles you expected them to play. The young man had shown him that. He had stood up for what was right, even when it meant going against his own father. The veteran could respect that. In some ways, it reminded him of his younger self, when he had fought not just for his country, but for what he believed in. As he reached the end of the street, the veteran found himself at a small park. He sat on a bench under a large oak tree, the leaves rustling gently above him. The park was peaceful, a quiet refuge from the world, and it gave him the space to think. He closed his eyes for a moment, taking in the sounds of nature, the chirping of birds, the distant hum of traffic, and allowed himself a brief moment of calm. It was during this silence that the veteran realized something important. He hadn't just been a witness to a confrontation in a restaurant. He had been part of something bigger. He had been part of a moment where change, however small, had been set in motion. The young man had tried to make things right, and that was all anyone could ask for. The veteran knew that change wasn't easy, especially when it came to old habits and ingrained prejudices, but it had to start somewhere. Maybe it would start with a conversation, with the kind of honesty the young man had shown. Maybe it would take time, but change could happen. The sound of footsteps approaching brought the veteran back to the present. He opened his eyes and saw a figure walking toward him. A familiar face. It was the young man from the restaurant, his face a little less tense than before, though there was still a hint of uncertainty in his expression. "I didn't expect to see you out here," the young man said, offering a small apologetic smile. "I just wanted to come and say thank you for being patient with us, for not making things worse. The veteran gave him a small smile in return. It's all right. You did what you had to do. The young man sat down next to him on the bench, glancing at the park around them. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about how things need to change, and I realized I need to be more than just sorry. I need to do something about it. I'm not going to let my dad's way of thinking continue. I'm going to make sure things are different here. The veteran nodded, his expression thoughtful. It's a good start, he said quietly. Change doesn't happen all at once. It takes time, patience, but it starts with people like you, who are willing to face the truth. The young man looked at the veteran, a mixture of gratitude and resolve in his eyes. Thank you. I don't know what will happen, but I promise I'll try my best. I won't let it slide. The veteran sat there for a moment, considering the young man's words. The weight of the situation had begun to lift, replaced by a quiet optimism. Sometimes, the world didn't make sense, and people could disappoint you. But sometimes, people could surprise you in the most unexpected ways. The young man had surprised him today, and in doing so, he had reminded the veteran that there was still hope for change, no matter how small the steps seemed. The veteran stood up from the bench, stretching his legs. He looked at the young man one last time. Keep going, he said with a nod. You're on the right path. The veteran continued walking down the quiet streets, his thoughts still lingering on the events of the day. He had expected the incident at the restaurant to leave him feeling angry or resentful, but instead, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. It wasn't the kind of hope that came from grand gestures or dramatic changes. No, this was quieter, subtler. It was the kind of hope that started with one person, one honest conversation, and the willingness to try to make things better. As he walked, he reflected on the conversation with the young man. The boy had spoken with such conviction, such sincerity that it left an impression on the veteran. He had seen people try to change before, but it was often out of convenience or fear. The young man, however, seemed genuinely committed to doing the right thing. He wasn't just apologizing for his father's behavior. He was determined to change the way things were in his own life and the way his family ran the restaurant. The veteran admired that. He couldn't help but think back to his own experiences. It had been many years since he'd returned from the war, and though the battles had ended, they had left scars, both visible and hidden. People often assumed that once a soldier returned home, life would go back to normal. But it wasn't that simple. The world outside had changed, but so had he. He had seen things, felt things that made it hard to relate to others. Yet, in that moment in the restaurant, when he saw the young man trying to stand up to his father, he realized that maybe there was a part of him that could still connect with the world. Maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late for things to change. As the veteran approached the bus stop, he paused for a moment, glancing up at the setting sun. The sky was painted with hues of orange and pink, the fading light casting long shadows across the pavement. There was something peaceful about the quiet of the evening, the way the world seemed to slow down as the day came to an end. He didn't have anywhere he needed to be. For the first time in a while, he didn't feel rushed. He wasn't running away from anything or trying to escape a past that haunted him. He was simply living in the moment, allowing himself the freedom to just be. When the bus arrived, he stepped onto it and found a seat by the window. As the bus pulled away, he watched the streets pass by, the familiar sights of the town growing smaller and smaller in the distance. His mind wandered back to the restaurant and the young man, still trying to process everything that had happened. He had been humiliated, yes, but he had also witnessed something rare, a glimpse of change. It was a reminder that, despite everything, people could learn, grow, and evolve. It wasn't always easy, and it certainly wasn't immediate, but change was possible. He had seen it today in the young man's eyes. The bus rumbled along, and the veteran leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes for a moment. He let the rhythm of the ride lull him into a sense of calm. his body relaxing as the day's events slowly faded into the background. He was no longer angry, no longer weighed down by the hurtful words of the restaurant owner. Instead, he felt something new, a quiet optimism for what lay ahead. It wasn't about expecting perfection or dramatic transformations. It was about recognizing that even the smallest of steps could lead to something bigger. As the bus made its way through the streets, the veteran allowed himself a small smile. The world might not always be fair, and people might not always treat each other the way they should, but there was still goodness to be found. The young man had reminded him of that. And for the first time in a long time, the veteran felt a sense of peace, knowing that change was possible, even if it took time. The bus ride continued as the veteran gazed out the window, watching the cityscape fade into the distance. As the evening wore on, the fading light of day was replaced by the soft glow of streetlights, casting long shadows on the pavement. The sounds of the bus, its tires humming against the road, the faint chatter of a few passengers, provided a steady rhythm, allowing the veteran to reflect on everything that had happened in the last few hours. He thought about the young man he'd met, the son of the restaurant owner. There was something about him that had left an impression. His sincerity, his willingness to admit that things weren't right, and his determination to change them. It wasn't often that you saw someone in a position like that, trying to make a difference despite the barriers that had been built around them. The veteran had seen people fight for causes before, but this felt different. This wasn't just about standing up to a person. It was about standing up for what was right. The veteran found himself thinking back to his own younger years, to the battles he had fought, both on the field and in his own life. He had seen his fair share of people refuse to change, to hold on to outdated beliefs simply because they had always known them to be true. It was a stubbornness that had caused a lot of pain, not just for him, but for others as well. But as he thought about the young man, he realized that maybe things didn't have to stay the same. Maybe, just maybe, the world could change if enough people were willing to face the hard truths and make a choice to do better. As the bus approached his stop, the veteran felt a small but growing sense of peace. He had walked away from the restaurant that day without knowing what would happen next. He didn't know if the owner would change, or if the young man's efforts would lead to anything lasting. But what he did know was that something had shifted in him. It wasn't about forgiving and forgetting. It was about understanding that sometimes change had to start with one person. It had to start with honesty, with facing what was wrong and working to make it right, even if it took time. When the bus came to a stop, the veteran stood up and made his way to the door. He stepped out into the cool evening air, the soft wind brushing against his face. The street was quiet, the neighborhood familiar. He didn't have any specific plans for the night. But as he walked down the street toward his home, he couldn't help but feel a bit lighter than he had before. The world hadn't changed overnight. He knew that. It wasn't that simple. But as he thought about the young man who was trying so hard to make a difference, the veteran couldn't help but believe that perhaps the small changes, those little moments of courage, of doing the right thing even when it wasn't easy, could add up over time. It wasn't about expecting perfection, but about hoping for progress, however slow it might be. The veteran reached his front door and paused for a moment, looking out at the night. He thought about the future, about what lay ahead, and for the first time in a long while, he felt like maybe there was hope for a world that could be a little bit better. Maybe, just maybe, change could start with one person, one honest conversation at a time. With that thought in mind, the veteran stepped inside his home, closing the door gently behind him. He wasn't sure what would come of the day's events, but he was certain of one thing. The world was full of possibilities, and sometimes all it took was a single moment of understanding to create a ripple of change.